Hello everyone, welcome to another session of the Polycon UK webinar. Today we have Sultan Mehmood from the New Economics School, who is going to talk to us about his paper on contract enforcement in a stateless economy. Feel free to ask questions in between. Sultan has agreed to take questions in between. We have 1 hour in the webinar and the floor is yours now. Thank you, Sultan, for being here.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to present this new paper, which is basically joint work with my longtime co-author Daniel. And since I have 1 hour, I will get right to it. So the motivation for this paper is based on the fact that illegal gambling markets are widespread across the world. For example, according to a report by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the annual global transactions in the illegal sports gambling market exceeds just over 1.7 trillion US dollars. And the illicit gambling market is in fact is estimated to be about 40 times larger than the size of the legal gambling market. However, how does transactions take place in this market and what makes this market run is largely unknown. So in this paper, we ask, how are contracts enforced in these markets? Second, what sustains contracts in this market? And third, especially in cases when legal enforcement is not possible of contracts, how contract enforcement can be fostered in these settings. So to answer this question, I focus on the illegal gambling markets, large illegal gambling market in Pakistan. So this is a city in Pakistan where you have gamblers waiting to bet at an illegal gambling den, which I will explain in a bit. So this is basically the Lahore Race Club. So this is where horse races, gamblers bet on horses, and betting takes place every Sunday at the Lahore Race Club. Now, gambling is a criminal offense in Pakistan, which is basically punishable up to 2 years in prison. However, what makes it interesting is that the ban and the jail time is not strictly enforced, which makes it us possible to observe many of the things which remain unobservable. And more importantly, because gambling is a criminal offense, the ban prevents legal enforcement of contracts. You cannot have the casino or the gambler go to a court of law and say that my contract was reneged. So it really allows us to study in a clean way what would happen if you have no legal enforcement, how many contracts will be enforced, and why would contracts be enforced in this case. So this is not just a cheap talk like that gambling is a criminal offense. People do go to prison if they are caught, especially if they are not paying the right people the right bribes. You would end up in jail as well. So since this is not a mystery novel, I will first give a brief overview of what I find. So this paper is basically in 2 parts. The first part involves collecting and providing descriptive evidence of what you find when you open up the books of the illegal gambling market. And it gives you one of the first glimpses of how these things work and provide some very interesting and surprising stylized facts, which are interesting to explain. So first thing which we find is that 70% of all debt obligations by the gambler are always paid back to the house in full. So if somebody promised that I will pay back next week, the money he or she pays back the full amount the next week. And it's not all or nothing situation. 87% of the people pay back at least something. So even if the gamblers cannot pay back everything, 87% of the people pay back something. So these facts are pretty interesting to just note by itself. Thirdly, we will test and find that we find no evidence for violence sustaining this market. In addition to anecdotal evidence, we collect quantitative data and try to ascertain how important is violence in sustaining this market, and we find no evidence of. So the evidence basically is pointing towards norms and something like honor among gamblers, which is sustaining this market, where contracts are enforced by just word of mouth promises. So this was the descriptive part of the study. We also have experimental evidence, which actually gets to the mechanisms which sustain this market. So for example, what we find is that when you make reputation important, the contract enforcement increases by about 0.25 standard deviation. What does 0.25 standard deviation mean? It means that gamblers, when you have increased reputation, their reputation at stake, they pay back additional amount of additional amount equal to 1/3 of their median monthly salary, just when the reputation becomes salient. And it's not just reputation which matters. There are also credit constraints at play. For example, if we relax the credit constraint by doubling the time that the gambler has to pay back the casino, what we find is that the gamblers do not run away because they have more time. They actually pay back even more. So finding that the payback is about 0.10 standard deviations higher, or they pay back an additional $30 or a quarter of their monthly wage. Now, the punchline is that illegal gambling seems to thrive on the same principles of reputation and credit constraints that sustain much of the modern legal markets, which is an interesting thing which we find. So that's like just a quick summary or overview of the presentation. Now I will go first very briefly talk about some of the literature this paper is speaking to. So broadly, this paper is speaking to three.
Hi, Sultan, a quick question.
Yes.
Does it matter here that gambling is a highly addictive activity? And so, it's likely that people want the interaction to be sustained.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, this is why we have the second. So we actually will learn something about addiction by looking at gambling per se. Now, I will just start with this since you asked this question. So I think one of the key contribution of this paper is that most of the literature, well, actually all of it, focuses, when they think about addiction, they think about alcohol, hard drugs, and smoking. So we will try to basically test some models of addiction, which, for example, Gary Becker's rational addiction model, and find actually evidence against it to show that that gambling acts much like an inconsistent time preference. I will unpack that later. Second, this paper speaks to the literature on contract enforcement, where basically a lot of literature shows that contract enforcement impacts social capital generation, it impacts technological adoption, human capital accumulation, and we basically will provide experimental evidence on how to foster contracts in settings when you have very limited legal enforcement. Thirdly, this paper will speak to this broad literature on illicit economy or shadow economies. Now, this is important because according to an estimate by Laporta and Schleifer, the informal or illegal markets account for about half of all global economic activity. And we will provide experimental evidence and descriptive evidence on working of a large illicit economy. So coming to one thing I wanted to also, I want to basically do a hat tip to this paper, which is like old paper by Evner Graff, which basically is a very cool paper, which basically looks at letters which the Maghribi Jewish merchants sent in the Islamic Mediterranean in the 11th century. And he basically hypothesizes that based on the letters, you can actually have contract enforcement without formal courts. And in his game theoretic model, building on these letters, he basically have a reputational based mechanism and a threat of exclusion from participating in the economy that ensures contract enforcement. So actually, this is partly this will inspire some of the experimental interventions which we will oversee this paper. And this, of course, is important because not just shadow economy is huge in the global economy, also because especially in early stages of development, you have reputational based exchanges which are really key for economic development. Now, moving on, this is how I've organized the presentation. I'll give you a bit of a background on how the betting market works. And I think the biggest challenge for me today is not to just present you to the results, but actually try to communicate with you the complexity of this market, which is absolutely fascinating. The kind of contracts they have, and the kind of contracts they introduce. Second, I will discuss some of the data we collect, our empirical specification, of course, results, and we'll do some, we pre-specified in a pre-analysis plan some heterogeneity analysis, which will allow us to go even deeper into the mechanisms. I don't think I will have time for going through the robustness checks, but it will give us some alternative explanations to what we find. So moving to the background. So first about gambling. So gambling in Pakistan is a criminal offense since 1977. Well, it was since British rule, but it was formalized for the whole country, the same law in 1977. And what this law says is that basically the police can enter and search any premises which is suspected of acting as a gambling facility. So it's a very intrusive law. And if you are found guilty, you are supposed to be in prison for 2 years. And if you do it again, then 3 years, 3 more years. So what does this imply? First of all, prison sentences and bans are not strictly enforced. So what happens is that you spend a week in jail, but not like much more. Usually the judge lets you go. But what this happens is that you don't have, even though you don't go for 2 years prison, the situation is such that since you cannot go to the court of law, you have basically no state enforcement of contracts in this market because the activity itself is illegal. So giving a bit more detail on the context. So how does the gambling work there? So basically what happens is gambling takes place every Sunday. Bettors gather at the Lahore Race Club to bet from 12 noon to 6 p.m. with horse races taking place every 30 minutes. And the betting takes place at 12 kiosks, which are called boxes or betting boxes, which I call betting stations. So you have these 12 betting stations, and anybody who gets a ticket to enter the race club, which the ticket is about 500 rupees, Pakistani rupees, which is about $2, $2.25. If you buy the ticket, you can enter and bet. So every betting station takes a 5% commission or a fee on winnings. So that's like how they make even more profit than they would otherwise. Now, the key and the most interesting thing, which has a lot of economics in it, is what the betting station offers. So every betting station offers something called a book bet, which is basically a contract which absolutely anybody can come and enter into, which is basically, I will bet today, but if I lose, I pay back next week. And if I win, also I pay back next week. So this has to be, the first time bettors has a book bet limit of about 5,000, well, exactly equal to 5,000 rupees, which is about $20. So this makes it like, also this speaks to Valeria's point a bit, that it reminded me of something like, trying a free coupon, a free drink. So basically you come, you try a 1 cigarette for free, something or like something very cheap. You don't have to pay now, you pay later. So it's kind of a product which is offered by everyone. So that's the book bet contract, which takes place in this setting. So this is how a betting station looks like. So each betting station has 3 people basic. Well, they have 3 people are essential, where the most important is the betting manager, betting station manager. He's member of the race club association, which is kind of a coalition. So you have like this betting, he's called the bookmaker. He basically manages the bets. You have the penciler. He basically pens down the bets. And then you have basically assistants to pen the penciler. So for example, sometimes it gets very, very crowded. So they also write stuff to make sure that everything is noted down correctly, or if it gets to, they help the penciler out. And this is, I guess, the most important person, Cash. Okay, so this is, notice also that the betting stations, there are several of them. There are 12 of them, and they look identical. They usually have almost always 4 people inside. So this is a betting station. Again, this is identical. This is me, and this part is very. This part will become very important. You will see that it's not here, but I will answer why this is important. So now we basically oversee a randomized controlled trial within one betting station. So what we do is basically we have, so every betting station has a special card, which basically acts like a security, where when you bet something, you write down your the amount bet. It's written in the gambling register, which is basically this place, and it's your amount you're gonna win or lose with your name or like your unique ID, which they assign, will also be written on a betting card. So it will be kind of, and it will be given to the gambler. So if you lose, you have to come and give back this betting card along with some cash. And if you win, you have to basically, you can give the betting card and you will be given money back. So this is kind of really like a currency in which really kind of how much economics is going on here. So it's kind of a market which is operating on its own kind of currency. Although what is different from a standard currency is that it's unique to the person. So it's a individual specific currency. So you cannot, for example, sell it or you cannot exchange it. Which also makes it difficult to have spillovers for the experiment as well. So the difference between the betting station we are helping organize the randomization basically is that we have different colored cards, and each color is basically, so this is randomly shuffled, and each color is a different contract which the betting station offers. So for example, so there are 4 contracts which we randomize. So we change contracts. First of all is the status quo contract, which we call the control contract, which is basically the standard book bet contract. This is what is happening in the whole betting stations. So basically you have a 7-day payback contract that if you, so it's this Sunday, I bet today, and next Sunday, I will pay back. So now it's what is interesting here in the placebo contract is the sanction, which is actually not very severe if you think about it. So if you don't pay back next week, it doesn't mean that you are excluded. What this means is that if you come to that betting station, you have to place cash and advance bets. You have to make a down payment of your potential losses. So basically, you can still book bet at other stations where you can again pay, and the only thing what you really lose is the ability to book bet at that station. And also, since you start up with 5,000 rupees book betting opportunity, over time, you can increase your book betting time. Since over time, when you increase your credibility by betting again and again and again, you build up your credibility and you can book bet larger and larger amounts. So you basically lose everything in one station, and that is like the sanction. But in principle, you can go and book bet it in another station other than 12. But what we do is we introduce a blacklisting contract where you have two kinds of blacklisting. One is a local blacklisting where we say name and shame the gamblers who didn't pay back. And second is global blacklisting, where we name and shame the gambler and exclude them from participating into the betting market. So this basically disentangles Avner Grief's social image conception of reputation versus social image plus exclusion from participation aspect of reputation. Third, we have the payment extension deadline, where basically we relax the credit constraints by basically doubling the payment time. So instead of paying back next Sunday, you will pay back the Sunday after that, so in 14 days. Finally, we also have a treatment arm, which actually had no effect on. Yeah, okay, Clement, maybe I'll answer your question first.
Hi, Sultan. Yeah, just clarification. So when you give them a treatment, can they decline it and just go to another betting station? So is there a competition between this betting station, or are they more like a cartel? And
so that's a great question. I think they act more like a cartel because there are only two. First of all the betting stations work together, and so this is why you could have a global blacklisting which excludes them everywhere. So they are much like a cartel. Now, what was your first question? You also asked?
Whether you, if because you said you're only doing the treatment at one station, so if the bettor comes and declines the contract you're offering, can they go to another station and bet somewhere else?
Yeah, great. So theoretically, they can, of course, do it. We don't observe a single bettor turning down our contract, which speaks about the bargaining power, what you are saying of this. But what they can do is they can bet different amounts, which we do observe actually.
Okay. Right.
So they cannot say, but they're kind of, by betting, they're also expressing their disapproval, so to speak. So we can speak about that. So finally, we have a decision aid contract. What does this mean? What we wanted to do is wanted to make bettors more like evidence-based decision makers because of our other papers, where basically we gave them betting odds and history on every horse. Basically on every horse which was winning, what were their best timings and what are the evolution of odds for the horse. So the idea was that they will make better decisions, but this had no effect on anything, which kind of all the three out, which kind of also one bettor kind of told us that, if you do it cold and calculating, this takes the whole fun out of the thing. So this is like, so basically it might be the case that really not calculating and like just playing on impulse or how you feel, intuition is really intrinsic to the gambling activity, which makes it difficult for us to kind of separate out. So how are the experiment rolled out? So basically, it's rolled out by reading out the contract. So it's there by word of mouth. So basically, if we don't intervene anything, you have this text read out by basically by all book betting stations, which basically I've translated it for you. Yes, Apurva.
Hi, there's a question on chat. I'll read it for you. The question is by Francesco Giovanni. He's saying, local blacklisting means you get named and shamed, but no sanction as such. And global means that you are blacklisted from all betting stations. So that's the question. So local means
this is exact, and I think this will, this is it. I think he's right, but to make it even more clearer, I can explain exactly what was the contract. So the status quo contract is you do a book bet, you can do a book bet, so payment will be made next Sunday in 7 days. Global blacklisting basically is reading out this text. If you do not, so originally it was another, just to point out. So if you do not make the book bet payment in 7 days, we will put your name on the notice board of this betting station. and inform all other betting station of your non-payment, leading to exclusion from book betting in the future. So basically, it's like really exclusion from the book betting. And the local blacklisting is just, if you do not make the book bet payment in 7 days, you will put your name on the notice board of this betting station, but will not inform all other betting stations of your non-payment. So it's not, exclusion is something else. We don't even inform anybody else. So the idea was that to kind of really make them feel sure that they will not be excluded. So basically, this is how it works. You note down the bets. This person, according to the randomized color-coded card, reads out the contract, and the bets are noted. So the blacklisting actually happened. It's not like it was not actually up to us for that not to happen, because there's credibility of the betting station involved. So all the people who didn't bet, their names go up at the betting station. So just to summarize, what was the design? So while that bettors stand in line, we collect some of their baseline characteristics, which we use in our balance test. When they come to bet at our station, they are randomly assigned 4 treatment contracts. And at the end of the day, for every bettor, we basically collect outcomes on the amount bet and their net winnings or net losses. And in week 2 and week 3, we basically collect their outcomes on payback. So how much money did they pay back? Yes, Max.
Max, you are on mute.
You're right. Sorry. And here is the number of people or number of attempts. And the second question is, what is the scale? So you told us it's 12 booths or stations, but is it the number of people? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands? Customers?
Yeah. So first of all, our sample consists of about 8,500 bets and 3,639 bettors. So it's like this is one thing, and N is the bettors. N is one gambler.
Thank you.
No problem. So this was just the summary of the design. So this is the betting queue, which basically takes place. So you have like kind of a queue, which basically where we were collecting our baseline characteristics. So just to bring home the point, what do we mean by local and global blacklisting? So there is no confusion. So the local blacklisting treatment only contains the social image mechanism for the name to be listed, because participation is available at other identical betting stations. So the sanction in both local betting station, local blacklisting, and other and status quo or book bet contract is just that no book betting at that station. On the other hand, the global blacklisting affects not just the social image. You have the name, but also it prevents future participation. So that's the difference between the two. So and you see, this is the betting stations are really identical. They not only is kind of have similar people, but also you have similar. They are even look alike. So the data is about 8,598 bets of bets. So
can I ask a question here?
Yes, please.
Did you ask, because you said that these were cartels essentially, right? So you could presumably tell the betting stations to do things. So in the local blacklisting setting, did you tell them, put the names of the ones who don't comply with you, but did you instruct them not to go and look at other blacklistings and blacklist? You see what I mean? So from an experimental point of view, if I am a bettor there, I don't know whether the fact that my name is put up there in front of everybody else also means that I'm going to be stopped from book betting from other stations or not, depending on whether the owner of the other station comes and look at this station's lists. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a fair point and a good question, because there are 12 betting stations, and this data on 3,639 is from one betting station. Essentially, there are probably more than 10,000 people betting on the day when we are were doing the experiment. So there are a lot of people, and everything is done on paper, as you saw things noted down. So there is most likely an imperfect information diffusion. So even though, so this is possible for sure, and it probably can happen and maybe does happen, but I can, given the context, there would be imperfect information diffusion to make this happen. And this is why you often see people book betting at other stations, because it's just the association, the cartel, so to speak, thinks it's profitable to let people book bet again and again. They are, yeah,
So
eventually.
That, and also it seems, so what I'm interested in is that from the bettor's perspective, they have an expectation on the probability, even with a local book betting, that they will be stopped from betting at other places. And your argument is because there's so many people there, it's probably too hard for the betting stations to go and read and do this enforcement. So at the end, probably that probability, those beliefs are probably very low. That's what we're saying.
Yeah,
right?
that's the key answer.
Yeah.
Okay. So like, yeah, so this is how basically one page of gambling transaction looks like. So it's held to decipher, and it's like, thanks to the penciler who allowed us, a guy who notes down the bet, who allows us to translate this. So these are just basically identity number, odds, the ID of, so the basically a unique ID. They're like economists, they uniquely tag people based on a number. This is horse, name of the horse. This is basically odds and then amount bet, etc. So just to kind of bring home the point that this is from next week during the experiment, that actually people are paying back cash, just so that it seems sensational, but people do come back and give back money. And yeah, we also learned that people are really drink a lot of tea in the betting station. Yeah, that's, yeah, unrelated. So so how do we do the estimation? We have a simple OLS estimation because we have random assignment of treated and control groups. So GBL is global blacklisting treatment, LBL is local blacklisting treatment, PD is payment deadline extension treatment. So you have alpha, beta, and gamma, which gives us the impact of treatment relative to the placebo or the standard book bet contract. But even cuter to show other than regressions is basically this bar charts, where we can just compare averages. And by the way, we see balance over characteristics of the gambler, etc., meaning that our color-coded cards were indeed successful in creating a balanced sample between the treatments and the placebo group. So coming to the to our outcomes on payback, so this is complete payback. So basically what we learn is that globally blacklisted people, 76% of them completely pay back their owed amount relative to the placebo contract, which is about 66%, which is a large and statistically significant difference. Moreover, even payment extension deadline matters, where relative to the placebo, the payment extension also increases contract. Now, a priori, this was not obvious, right? If you increase the extension deadline, you could easily have a story where the gamblers come to their senses and say, well, okay, actually, I don't want to pay back after all. But you find that gamblers are probably going out of the way, collecting funds and maybe bothering their relatives or whatnot to kind of pay back, to pay back additional amount. And it's not just complete payback. We can even see partial payback, meaning that whether you pay back some money, and we find that very, very high amount of people actually pay back at least something. So it's like really like about 97% of the people are paying back at least something relative to the placebo. And the effects are largely similar in terms of the largest effect is of global blacklisting relative to the placebo, then local blacklisting, and then the payment extension. We can also look, yes,
about this partial payback, because I meant to ask this earlier. How should we understand this? Why do they pay partially, and what do they want to achieve? You know, the bettors.
Yeah. So we'll also look at the distribution, and we'll see like they pay like usually at least 60% of the owed amount, the partial payback people. And what appears to be, I think, again, is the reputation element, that if you pay back at least something, you kind of still don't lose your face or whatnot. And like you kind of, so it kind of still does not erode your the credibility there. So that would be one logic to kind of explain it.
Okay, thanks.
So we can also look at the fact that the intensive margin, so the amount paid back, not just whether they paid back or not. So if you look at global blacklisted, they pay back about 0.26 standard deviation higher amounts than the control contract, the control book contract. Similarly, the payment deadline pays back about 0.13 standard deviation higher amount. So you actually have the size of the economy seems to be increasing by introducing these interventions. Now, coming to the distributions, this is actually the fraction of money paid back. What we learn is that very, very few people pay back very, very little amount. So it kind of, so most of the people of all treatment groups pay back at least 60%, which kind of is suggesting that, you know, like this is what Max's question, that is, if you pay back very little, maybe it's not credible. If you pay back at least a substantial amount, you are kind of still saving your face or whatnot. So now this is, I'm going to present you a rather surprising result, and I will invite you to theorize why this might be happening. And this completely surprised us. And I have an interpretation, which I will give in the end. So what do we find for the amount bet? So you would think that we have introduced this weird, like say, contracts, which people don't want and they want to reject. So when we offer the global blacklisting, most of the models which we thought about would have that, you know, you are introducing a cost and a sanction, which will reduce the demand. And this will reduce the amount bet. But what we find for global blacklisting is actually the opposite, where the amount bet increases by about 0.2 standard deviations. So people are betting about 8,000 rupees more relative to the placebo. So any suggestions, ideas here are more than welcome. Yeah, I have an interpretation, so I will not like, I know we wrote the paper, so I will give you my take as well. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask, do the participants understand that the other participants will not know what their treatment arm is? Like basically people who are on the global blacklisting arm, do they believe that everybody knows that they are?
I don't think, given the betting rush, that it's clear to them that it's like on the spot decision that this thing is read out. They usually say okay, but then they bet different amounts, whatnot. So, but it does kind of reveals when you are actually put on. So I don't think at the time people know, but once you are named, then of course it becomes.
Yeah, but you see, it matters whether they think that people know or not, because if they think that people know, then them not being blacklisted is also a signal.
Yeah, yeah. I think people would know eventually, but not right when the treatment is being assigned.
Okay, I was just wondering about, like, you know, the reputational gain that they could get basically from betting on the global blacklisting and possibly on betting more on that.
So basically what you're saying is that the positive effect comes because this increases the credibility or confidence in the market, that this increases their reputation. That yeah.
Well, I'm saying it could be. I'm saying it could be.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, definitely that's an interpretation. Yeah, good point. Also, another which is related to this point is that you could have that people are saying, okay, I'm gonna not pay back next week, so I'm gonna just bet a large amount. But we don't find that to be the case, because if this was the case, the payback should also be lower for the global blacklisted, but we actually find larger payback. So which makes it very difficult to explain by just like YOLO arguments, like you only live once, that you just kind of say that, you know, I'm going to just I'm in this blacklisted, I'm going to just bet everything and not pay back, but actually you do pay back. Yes, yes, yes.
So do you have the extensive margin on this result as well? So because you said people don't really refuse the contracts you offer them, but this could be a composition effect where a few small bettors reject it, and then you only have the large bettors that accept it. But you said you don't really see anyone rejecting it. Was that the case here too, or?
Yeah. And we will actually show in a robustness section that it's not a compositional effect. That's a great point. You could have a compositional effect, and we make like pin scatters to show that actually it's at all deciles. The effect holds for all deciles. Okay. So coming to an interpretation, so this is one interpretation, which is something which is kind of speaking to, so again, notice like it's our interpretation, like an interpretation, it's not like the interpretation. So basically, if we think about it in terms of addiction, we find that you would have rational addiction. Models would predict that since you have sanction, the cost has gone up. So you would have a smaller payback and amount bet, but we find the opposite in both cases. And I think the evidence is consistent with like Hosch and Lowenstein's model of addiction, which basically they call it the model of spontaneous demand, which basically considers that addictive good involves time inconsistency. So for example, today blacklisting increases your demand. The global blacklisting may induce like a mismatch between your present and future consumption of the addictive good. So you would basically, so how I understood this model was that basically you say, okay, YOLO, we live only once. I am going to go and bet everything. Are we going to bet more? And you bet more and said, okay, I'm not going to pay back. But then once you lose, you think, okay, well, but you're addicted. And you say, okay, well, but I got to play again. And I got to play larger amounts. I want to book bet. And then you kind of come back and pay back. So it's kind of this time inconsistency could be one interpretation, which is consistent with at least one theory which we saw on addiction. So also, it's not just that they're betting larger amounts. This is actually costing them. So it's not just that they have larger amounts being bet, they also win less. So you also see lesser winnings. And this is also interesting that if you look at the average winnings, it's negative, which means that house is careful about setting the expected values right, you know. So they are making sure that the odds are set in a way that the expected value to win is negative for the bettors. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is repetition appears to be important in this market. Despite losing more, gamblers bet larger amounts, pay back more often and in larger amounts. And it's not just repetition. Things like credit constraints also matters. When you increase the time for the gambler to pay back, they are able to pay back even more. Coming to, I guess this is, I'm surprised. Maybe it's because I said the threat of violence doesn't explain this result, but usually, especially when I presented it last week in the US, everybody was just into mafia and saying like, you know, it's gotta be threat of violence, you know, it's gotta be like gangs and threat of violence. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised that this crowd has not grilled me too much on it. Still you can, but I'm just saying the reason why I don't think threat of violence is, first, I did a book bet and there was no, there is no repercussions if you don't pay back. You can actually do it anonymously. Second, and more importantly, we actually collect data on violence. And what we do is we basically do two things. First of all, we ask individual bettors whether they fear violence for themselves if they do not pay back. And what we find is it's not just important that the treatment effect, it's not affecting our treatment, and that's what would cause us issues if like our treatment was actually changing it. But even I think a deeper point is that how few people actually report that they fear violence. So for example, if you look at here, like less than 0.1% of the people say that they would fear violence if they do not pay back. And we also ask another question: have you heard other people fear violence? And still you see like very, very few people actually say that they have heard other people as well, although more than violence, because gossips go around more faster. But still, this is kind of an interesting. So it's impossible to rule out threat of violence completely, because threat. How would you define a threat? But based on a lot of anecdotal accounts and actually collecting this data for both yourself and for others, we find that first, our treatments are not affecting this. But second, and I think more fundamentally, threat of violence does not seem to be the key factor explaining this, explaining our this market, which kind of suggests that maybe, much like the legal markets, it's maybe unprofitable to kind of sustain this economy. It would scare off the potential addictors, because they want to kind of give this product a book betting. And if people think that there is this violence thing which I'll have to deal with, people will not kind of start and come. So they continuously need a new blood injected in to continue, because people go bankrupt, right? Like this lose. So this kind of violence more probably is a cost which they cannot bear. Sorry, Max, I didn't call you.
No, it's okay. This is so the point of threat of violence is not that the violence would be widespread. It's just that the threat exists, and that keeps everyone paying, and that's why nobody is actually afraid of anything, because they. So I was fascinated by this figure, and I can't stop thinking about this when you showed the magnitude, and there was a break at 60%. Mm-hmm. It's such a clean break that I would sort of try to think a little bit more about what keeps it exactly at 60%. Is there and the reason in this context, what happens if you pay less than 60%? Maybe then you could cross-check it with this personal fear of violence and things like that. Maybe everybody pays above 60%, because this is where the threat of violence disappears. I don't know. I'm just speaking aloud, thinking aloud. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess this could be. So I'm not aware of any kind of norm which kind of is that at 60% you'll get your knees broken and 30% it won't. But I guess this is a simple exercise to do, to basically see whether the violence is higher or lower in this case. Yeah. And like I said before, like it's so we can always suppose. So you start with this thing: threat of violence exists. Let's suppose threat of violence doesn't exist. How would you disprove it? I'm just saying it's like the threat element makes it so hard to kind of. So people, if for example I show this, some people are going to misreport no matter what happens. Like so it's like even if you have zero, even then it's not clear, right? It's like so I'm just So that's it's a very difficult thing to kind of rule out, but what we have done is that we have gathered some anecdotal accounts from gamblers and presented this evidence and say, okay, threat of violence doesn't seem to be the most important thing which is sustaining this market. So this is like trying to see the compositional effects, where basically if we see that the payback amount for all the 4 treatment groups, you basically have similar amount where 10 complete payback is they are positively correlated across all groups. Now, how much time do I have?
10 more minutes.
Okay. So why does reputation and payment extension matter? So to get at that, we basically do a bit of a heterogeneity analysis, where we pre-specify 4 strategic dilemmas, which basically might explain heterogeneous effect. So some gamblers are different in their preferences than others. This is what it assumes. So basically, we also try to get at addiction by looking at whether the gambler is a regular gambler or an irregular gambler, and see whether the effects are different or not. And so our first thing is we basically look at the results of payback by gambler regularity. So the regular gamblers versus the one-timers. And what we find, first of all, vast majority are regular gamblers, which is speaking to kind of the addiction story. But what we find is that regular gamblers, when they get a payment extension, they pay back, they're more likely to pay back, and they pay back larger amounts, which is kind of again consistent with a possible addiction story. And also they lose more, they bet more, and they lose more. This is also kind of suggesting that this heterogeneity analysis is suggesting. So payback rate is about 0.2 standard deviations higher for regular gamblers relative to irregular gamblers, which seems to suggest that credit constraints appear to mediate regular gamblers' demand or participation in this informal economy. In addition, there is again a surprising result on risk, where the more risky gamblers, when they are blacklisted, they pay back more often and larger amounts, which is basically, again, it comes back to the story which I was getting at before, that risky globally blacklisted gamblers are paying back more, bet larger amount, despite losing more. And it may be the case that risk-loving individuals enjoy the risky illegal gambling environment, so they are more likely to fulfill contractual obligations under the threat of being excluded. So blacklisting may increase their confidence in the market. So this is one explanation which might explain this heterogeneity by risk, where blacklisted gamblers are.
Sorry, how do you measure risk?
So it's like looking at certainty equivalence. So you just ask the gamblers, play a lottery pre-treatment with the gambler and ask whether they are risk loving or risk seeking. Higher amount is risk loving there. Okay, so there is some robustness check, since we pre-specified about 3 different outcome variables. There is a possibility of having false positives. So we basically take into account for that by basically doing the John list correction for multiple hypotheses, and we find the results are essentially similar. We do also Gudo-Ambens test of randomization inference, which basically says that if you either our results is driven by a weird sample, and we find our results to be unchanged. Also, we don't find any effect on attrition. Now, attrition is not that, so we had 100% compliance on our contracts, but the payback people were naturally different from all the people, because you can only pay back if you lose. So whether the losers are different from like all gamblers, and we find it's uncorrelated with our treatments. They might as well be different, but that's the attrition variable that's measuring here. So decision aid we find to be uncorrelated with any of our outcome variables. So in conclusion, so like I began that, informal economic activities is huge, half of the global economic activity. Now, what we try to look here is like what makes this environments self-sustaining, what drives decision-making in such economies. We find that 70% of gamblers completely fulfill their contractual obligations, even though you have no legal enforcement by the courts. 87% pay back at least something. And we present some evidence for violence not explaining this, sustaining this economy. So in a nutshell, the illegal gambling market appears to thrive on the same principles of reputation and credit constraints that basically run much of the legal modern economies. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think there's a hand raised by Santiago if you want to ask your question.
Yes.
Yeah, I am going to. So if I were to take repeated games seriously, every type of non-compliance is due to an